Welcome to the Manga Bay Newscast. It's September 29th, 2021, and I'm your host, Mike Gorecki, bringing you the news and inspiration from nature's front line. Today we're taking a closer look at the important role of indigenous peoples in biodiversity conservation. We're actually at something of an inflection point in the history of conservation and indigenous engagement. So-called fortress conservation, which makes nature off-limits to human use altogether, even for indigenous and local communities who may have lived in the area for generations, has come to be viewed as counterproductive and even a perpetuation of often violent colonialism by Western nations. There's growing recognition today of just how vital traditional ecological knowledge and practices are to the cause of conservation, and a movement for securing indigenous rights to safeguard the future of our planet is well underway. There's plenty of science to bolster this movement, such as a World Bank study that found that even though indigenous lands account for less than 22% of the world's land area, their traditional territories are home to about 80% of the world's biodiversity. Yet violence against land defenders, and indigenous land defenders in particular, continues to escalate. The NGO Global Witness reports that 227 land and environmental defenders were killed in 2020, and 1/3 of them were indigenous, even though indigenous peoples make up just 5% of the global population. Meanwhile, we have a chance to enshrine indigenous rights in conservation pacts being negotiated at the highest levels right now, but it's not clear we'll take that opportunity. As you're aware, if you listened to the last episode of the Manga Bay Newscast, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature just held its World Conservation Congress in Marseille, France, earlier this month, where indigenous groups were afforded full voting status for the first time, and an indigenous-led motion to support the protection of 80% of the Amazon rainforest by 2025 was approved. The World Conservation Congress was an important precursor to the upcoming UN Biodiversity Conference, known as COP15, where delegates from around the world will negotiate a plan for addressing the biodiversity crisis we're currently facing. The UN released a draft of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework in July, the centerpiece of which is a global 30 by 30 target, or protection of 30% of the planet by 2030, through area-based conservation measures like national parks and other protected areas. Critics say this is the wrong approach to safeguarding the future of our planet, and that, at worst, a global 30 by 30 target could reproduce some of the worst impacts of fortress conservation, namely dispossessing millions of indigenous peoples of their ancestral lands. Here to help us unpack all of this is Victoria Tauli-Corpuz, a member of the Kankana-ey-Igorot people of the Philippines. She is a former UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the current executive director of the Tebtebba Indigenous Peoples International Center for Policy Research and Education based in Manila. Tauli-Corpuz tells us about her experiences at the IUCN World Conservation Congress, the Global Indigenous Agenda released at the Congress that would put a land rights-based approach and funding for self-determined ecosystem management at the heart of biodiversity conservation, and what she hopes to see happen at the Convention on Biological Diversity's COP15. We'll also be joined by Zach Romo, Program Director for the Coordinator of Indigenous Organizations of the Amazon Basin, a group more commonly referred to by its Spanish acronym, COICA. Romo is here to tell us about the successful motion to protect 80% of the Amazon pushed by COICA and many other groups at the World Conservation Congress, what comes next now that the motion was approved by members of the IUCN, and what COICA will be advocating for at the upcoming UN Biodiversity Conference.
We hope that all the effort that indigenous peoples in the Amazon is recognized and treated with equity and justice.
Anyone following conservation news lately has probably heard a lot about the role of indigenous peoples in conservation, how important it is historically, and how recently announced 30 by 30 conservation goals might impact indigenous communities. Numerous countries have adopted their own 30 by 30 targets and are expected to push for a global 30 by 30 target at COP15, which takes place online next month and continues next year in person in Kunming, China. Last June, we actually dedicated a whole episode of the Manga Bay Newscast to looking at U.S. President Joe Biden's proposal to implement a 30 by 30 target in the United States as part of his climate strategy, and you can find a link to that in the show notes for this episode. But it's so important that we listen to indigenous people themselves when discussing all of this. So I asked Victoria Tauli-Corpuz to tell us about the results of the IUCN World Conservation Congress and how much she felt indigenous voices were actually being listened to.
Generally, I think the results of the IUCN Congress from an indigenous person's perspective is quite good, because I think the fact that indigenous peoples are now a member, they have a particular category in the IUCN membership. There were many indigenous peoples from various regions who took part, and they held their own global conference of indigenous peoples prior to the formal to the meetings, no, and they came up with a agenda which they call Global Indigenous Peoples Agenda, which is for the protection of their territories, their coastal seas, their waters, as well as their resources. So that global agenda has been provided to the IUCN Congress, and in the Marseille Manifesto that the IUCN Congress came up with, one of their points in their commitment to action is the implementation of this first IUCN Global Indigenous Agenda. So that's the first thing I wanted to say, that at least the effort of indigenous peoples to come together and define what are their priorities and bring this to the attention of the Congress, and there was a motion to include this in the commitment to action, is a good thing. The other thing that there were several under the commitment to action. They also, of course, have mentioned the importance of respecting the rights of indigenous peoples, as well as the protection of environmental rights defenders who are being killed or criminalized, no, whose rights are being violated. So this is important for us because in the Congress we held several events where indigenous peoples who were criminalized or who have been harassed and their rights violated. We held several events where we got these people to speak out and talk about how they were criminalized in the protected areas, no. So accepting that as part of the commitment to action, as well as the motion passed to protect environmental rights defenders, is something that we can use in the future, no, whenever there are these events, these very bad incidents of human rights violations happening. The other thing that I think is good is of course, the Amazon indigenous peoples. No, there is a big number of them. They went there and they were lobbying strongly for the protection of 80% of the Amazon by 2025. And there was a motion that was passed to support this goal of the Amazon indigenous peoples. This is motion 129. And of course, they also decided to have an indigenous counselor as a member of the IUCN leadership body, and there were several commitments to ensuring that indigenous peoples have also equitable and direct access to finances that will meet the goals of the Global Biodiversity Framework. Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. So in general, I think that indigenous peoples, at least the demands and the requests of indigenous peoples, have been integrated in the final documents. So that's good. Of course, the implementation of this is something that we have to ensure and monitor closely, because as you know, the IUCN, even in the past, they already have declared that they will be using a human rights-based approach to conservation. But that was in Durban, I think, in 2003. But in between that time and at present, there are still ongoing violations of human rights of indigenous peoples in their territories, no? Like the torture of the pygmies in the Congo, the displacement of the Karen peoples, for instance, from the Kankana-ey-Igorot National Park of Thailand, which was approved by UNESCO despite all the opposition, So there are still many developments which are not good, and so our task is to ensure that these declarations, these commitments, and motions will be implemented. And this will be also used to influence the results of the CBD, Global Biodiversity Framework. So that's in short, that's how I look at it, and that's also how I see that these declarations and these commitments can only happen if there is also a strong, of course, participation of indigenous peoples in these processes, as well as is very effective monitoring processes to check whether indeed the states, the conservation organizations, as well as the corporations are going to implement these declarations.
You mentioned that the Marseille Manifesto that came out of the IUCN Congress adopted the principles of the Global Indigenous Agenda. Could you tell us a bit more about what exactly the agenda calls for?
It calls for, of course, a human rights-based approach to conservation, which means respect for the rights of indigenous peoples to their lands, territories, and resources. The need to obtain their free, prior, informed consent when their areas are being included as part of protected areas, as well as the protection of human rights and environmental defenders, many of which are indigenous peoples. It also calls for the adequate financing of indigenous peoples to be able to continue their self-determined governance of protected areas and other means of protecting the territories. No? So in a nutshell, that's basically what the global agenda is calling for, and it's good that it has been included in the commitment to action of the Marseille Manifesto.
It's particularly important that it was included in the Marseille Manifesto because I know that with the Convention on Biological Diversity's COP15 coming up, this will be a major point of discussion, this rights-based approach to conservation, as opposed to the protected area-based model of the 30 by 30 plan, right?
Well, of course, it's really important for indigenous peoples because, as I mentioned earlier, one of the sources of violations of the rights of indigenous peoples are the carving out of protected areas by governments with the support of big conservation organizations, no? And, as a special rapporteur, I did a particular report on conservation and its impacts on indigenous peoples. And I found a lot of evidence which shows that indigenous peoples in Africa, in Asia, and even in Latin America have experienced eviction, from their own traditional territories, as well as arrests, and the criminalization of indigenous peoples who are fighting to protect their environment. No, I have also seen that there are some favorable court decisions. For instance, the Inter-American Court on Human Rights made a good decision about the entry of a mining company, against the entry of a mining company in Suriname, in one of the protected areas of Suriname where the Kalinya and Lokono peoples live. And there was a decision that that company should not come in, and the people who have been displaced should be brought back, among others. But the implementation of this has not been done yet. So I've witnessed myself. I went to the communities where these are happening. I had a visit to Congo, and I also talked with the victims, the Baka and the Batwa peoples. They are called pygmies, but they don't like that term, who were also arrested on the guise that they are poaching wildlife, and several of their relatives are still in jail, and they have been there for a long time. So this is really the picture that you see when you go to these countries where protected areas are found. And the most recent one, as I mentioned earlier, was the Kankana-ey Park in Thailand, which was inscribed as a World Heritage Site by the UNESCO, despite the opposition of myself as a rapporteur in the past, and even the present rapporteur, as well as the various rapporteurs of the UN, the special rapporteurs. Also, the IUCN itself has said that we should not inscribe it, because there are still lingering cases of violations of the rights of the Karen. But in the end, like last July, they inscribe it as a World Heritage Site. So that's why we are stressing the importance of really putting a human rights-based approach to conservation in the center, in the center of the work of all these in these conservation efforts being undertaken. Because if that is not done and there is a 30 by 30 target, which means increasing by 30% the protected areas in the world, then again the violations of these rights can be even further enhanced, increased. No, so that's the main reason why the human rights approach is really a very key demand of indigenous peoples, and we want this to enter the global biodiversity framework that will be agreed upon by the Conference of Parties of the Biodiversity Convention. That's really the backdrop, no, and of course we also know that we contribute, as we all know, that the 80% of the world's biodiversity are found in indigenous territories. And the reason for that is because they have been fighting to protect these territories, but they also have the knowledge and the culture, the worldview on how to protect the animals, the plants, and all other living and non-living things in these territories. No, so I think that's also something that indigenous peoples have been pushing for a long time. And if you look at the Marseille Declaration, they are now talking about a transformative agenda that should be adopted by the CBD. And of course, for us, a transformative agenda means that the rights of the peoples are protecting this biodiversity will be protected and respected, and their knowledge and their practices in protecting and enhancing this biodiversity should also be supported. And therefore, the support, the funding, they should have direct access also to the funding, because they need a lot of resources to be able to effectively protect their own territories. And if they are indigenous governments, who are the ones directly responsible for doing this, they should be supported to continue doing this. Indigenous peoples feel it's their duty, not just to themselves, but to the world and to nature in general. It's their duty to do this. And this talk in the IUCN about a transformative agenda, about the need to change culture in as far as it relates to nature, these assertions are somehow an acceptance that indeed the culture and values of indigenous peoples, living in harmony with nature, is now being looked upon with a better, with a better perspective, and the dominant world is being called to also adapt this kind of culture as far as the relationship with nature is concerned.
How optimistic are you about the Convention on Biological Diversity, COP15, actually taking up this rights-based approach? A draft of the Biodiversity Agreement released ahead of the conference only refers to indigenous peoples in 3 of its 21 targets, and only gets around to mentioning the need to respect indigenous peoples' rights over lands, territories, and resources in the last target. Do you expect it to be a big fight to get a human rights-based approach acknowledged more fully?
Well, I think yes. I think it's going to be a big fight, because we know for a fact that there will be many governments who are not necessarily sympathetic to indigenous people's rights, no? And of course, this is going to be held in Kunming in China. And, we don't know what the position of China is as far as this is concerned. So I think it's going to be an uphill struggle, but indigenous peoples, nevertheless, including their allies, will go there and assert that this should really be brought in, and it should be not just in 3 references, but also in the various targets that are being mentioned. For instance, the target 1, I think it's on spatial planning. In indigenous peoples should be mentioned there, because this means that they are able to delineate and demarcate their ancestral lands, and they are able to have a say. They will be able to have a say on how this space, how the plans for these particular spaces will be made. So I think it will not be an easy thing. I'm not so optimistic, but I would like to believe that many of these governments and other actors who will be there will be seriously thinking, because they have not achieved their Aichi targets. Many of the biodiversity targets in the past have not really been achieved in a satisfactory way. So if there's a realization that this was not achieved because they were always pursuing the work with business as usual, then maybe it's about time that they will think in more transformative ways that will allow for the achievement of the 2030 targets. So I'm holding my I don't like to be very optimistic, but I'm still hoping that there will really be satisfactory references to indigenous peoples in both the targets and the indicators, and that mechanisms will be put in place to achieve these targets. For instance, the issue of human rights defenders or environmental rights defenders, they have to have a complaint mechanism set up somehow, where those who are victims of these kinds of violations can complain and there will be actions taken. So in the end, we want to see also the exact, the elaboration of a mechanism that will put, that will effectively implement these targets and goals and indicators.
I know that 30 by 30 will be the main target that a lot of governments will be pushing for at the COP15. What are your views on 30 by 30 targets, and do you see a way for them to coexist with this rights-based approach?
Well, I think that 30 by 30 is the goal, that 30% of the world's terrestrial and marine areas be 30% of this should be protected and conserved, and for as we are in a very serious climate change crisis, the biodiversity crisis, of course, and the health crisis. I think it should be a good goal, no? But on the condition, it will be a good goal and it can be achieved, but on the condition that indigenous peoples and local communities who are living in these protected areas, who are depending on these areas that might be that might be included as protected areas, that they will be involved in designing this protected area, in managing it, as well as in receiving equally the resources that they need to be able to effectively do it. So, now I think that with the crisis that we are all facing, we have to admit that we have to do much more in terms of protecting nature, which is basically the source of our survival. But for us to protect it, we have to really protect those who are in the front lines of doing this work, this duty of protecting these areas. So I don't have really that. I mean, with the target as it is, that's not a big problem for me. For as long as the rights are going to be, respected, and for as long as participation, the inclusivity, inclusion of indigenous peoples in deciding and managing these protected areas is ensured, and also the resources that they need to be able to do this effectively is in place. And there is also a monitoring system that will monitor whether indeed these rights are being protected and biodiversity is not being eroded. We say that, but we agree, but on the basis of these conditions. If these conditions are not met, then of course we will oppose it. If there is a country who comes to our territory and says we have to carve out this territory of yours because we need to meet this 30 target, and then they don't even include us, we will protest. And indigenous peoples now have really been sophisticated enough to know that they do have rights to these territories, and if their rights are being violated, they will protest. And you can imagine, you can anticipate that there might be some conflicts, between government agencies, between the environmental guards and indigenous peoples. So conflict mediation processes should also be in place so that these kinds of conflicts can be managed and mediated in the most effective manner.
Speaking of conflict mediation, that's obviously a really important aspect of all this because, of course, it is still an incredibly dangerous time to be standing up for your rights and protecting your lands, especially if you're an indigenous person. I know Global Witness recorded 227 lethal attacks against land defenders last year, the most since it started tracking this in 2012, and 1/3 of those attacks targeted indigenous people. Do you think that making this rights-based approach core to our conservation efforts will help address this problem, or what more would need to be done?
First of all, I think that there should be policies or laws put into place that recognize and that protects the rights of indigenous peoples. Many countries don't have that. Most countries, the countries who have laws that protect indigenous peoples' rights are mostly in Latin America. In Asia, it's basically the Philippines and Taiwan, and to a certain extent, Malaysia. In Africa, you hardly have any law that protects indigenous people's rights. So if that is the situation and that is not rectified, then we can assume that there will really be a lot of problems that will come up. So that's why we are saying that it's when they say support a human rights based approach, it means that the governments should put some laws in place that will protect these people. They should put mechanisms, institutions that will support the indigenous peoples in having their rights respected and protected. And they should have they should also recognize the identities of these peoples. I mean, many indigenous peoples are not recognized as such, and therefore they cannot assert that they have the right because the government don't recognize them as indigenous peoples. No, so those are the very basic prerequisites of ensuring that the rights-based approach is going to work. Having a policy in place, having an institution that implements these policies, and engaging indigenous peoples in shaping and making these protected areas, as well as getting their prior informed consent if they agree that their territories be included as protected areas. There are many conditions in which it can work, and we know very well that it's not very easy to do all this. So it's an ongoing struggle as far as indigenous peoples are concerned. They know very well that they still have to continue doing the usual work of using international human rights instruments to transform the laws in the national level, and also strengthening the indigenous governments, the autonomous governments that are existing, because they are the ones who can provide a good example of how an area can be better protected when the indigenous peoples themselves are the ones governing and deciding on how this will be, how this will contribute to biodiversity goals. So my thinking is that the 30 by 30 should automatically include, the respect for the rights, the human rights based approach, and they should not be in conflict with one another, and the ones who are very much pushing for this, like for instance conservation organizations, should do a better work in terms of themselves protecting and supporting indigenous peoples. I've seen some examples in Africa where the big conservation organizations don't even visit, they don't even support the indigenous peoples who were jailed because they were falsely accused as poachers who were tortured by the environmental or ecological guards that the governments have established with the support of conservation organizations. So there's even these conservation organizations themselves have a lot to do in terms of demonstrating their sincerity in implementing this human rights-based approach.
Can you tell us about the work you do with Tebtebba, and what is the current political situation in the Philippines like? Is it difficult to do your work?
Well, Tebtebba is a global, it's an institution that does global work. So we have work in countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And basically, the focus of our work is really to raise awareness of indigenous peoples on their rights. So we hold regular trainings on what are indigenous peoples' rights and what is international human rights law. And so to train them also for advocacy, so we hold trainings for those who are coming to these meetings like the CBD or the climate change, to train them to be effective in terms of doing their advocacy, influencing governments and also other actors in that arena. We do a lot of monitoring. We have this indigenous navigator and the community-based monitoring systems where we train our indigenous partners to do the monitoring themselves. So they do mapping, they map their own ancestral territories, they do their own resource inventories so that they will know what are the resources that are there, what's the biodiversity in their territories, and to monitor whether these are being degraded or these are increasing. So in general, that's what we are all about. We do the research, and we publish it. We have these advocacy trainings, capacity building for indigenous peoples, and then of course the monitoring schemes. So the center of what we do is to strengthen indigenous peoples communities, at the local level, because we believe that if we are able to strengthen the indigenous communities, they will be able to really fight even strongly to protect themselves against the rights, the way their rights are being violated. No, so here in the Philippines, it's not easy, especially with this program of the government, which is to go against so-called terrorists. And they include everybody who has said something bad about the president or what have you. They include this in a list of terrorists. I myself has been included in that list. In 2019 there was a list of so-called 600 terrorists, and I was included there, even if I was the special rapporteur, on the rights of indigenous peoples. So that's the risk in the Philippines. But thankfully, we are not. Of course, we are scared. We know the risks, but people are still strongly asserting that there should be a better democratic space for us to be able to operate. There was a case filed in the court against the anti-terrorism law. Anytime that there are people that are killed or arrested falsely, arrested unjustly, we have campaigns to expose this and to get the bodies like the UN Human Rights Council, the special rapporteurs, among others, to speak out. So that's where we are in right now. We are not in a very good situation, but I think the experience of the Filipino people against martial law is something that has taught us that we cannot give up. We just have to continue, asserting our rights and claiming this, and putting into place, systems that will ensure that the world knows about what is happening to us, and that there will be big voices that will protest against what our government is doing. In fact, we also have engaged directly with the military command, so are operating in our communities, because the communities are also being harassed. The people, the military and the police, they go there and they ask them to sign onto paper saying that they are surrendering, because there is a large incentive, monetary incentive, for the police or the military who are able to get more people surrendering, so-called. But in the process, they harass the families. So we have, in fact, today, a high-level military official came to the office to talk with us, because we reach out up to the highest level to complain against this harassment of our indigenous peoples in their own territories. And so we are having also dialogues with them.
So do you feel like things are improving there in the Philippines? Is it becoming easier to do your work? Do you feel safe there doing your work?
Well, it's not. I don't. I think it's it's an okay environment. It's just that we feel that we have to do it. Where else will we go? Many of us refuse. In fact, when I was in the list, there were people offering that I can get myself in exile. And it's all that. But many of us, we don't think that that's what we should do. We think that we should still stay here and continue to do what we're doing. And of course, getting the world to support us. In fact, the International Criminal Court has decided that the government, Duterte, will be investigated, because of the drug killings that he has been doing, this killing these so-called drug addicts, which of course some of them are actually human rights defenders, So we managed to get the International Criminal Court to finally agree that they will investigate the government, at least the president and his minions. That's what we do. I think, even if it's quite risky, we have no other option, but to continue doing what we're doing in terms of advocating for our rights, but in terms of reaching out also and getting broader support, not just within the country, but also outside of the country.
Would you care to leave us with any final thoughts on the importance of Indigenous rights to building a sustainable future for everybody?
Well, yes, I think that, really respecting the rights of Indigenous peoples to self-determination, which includes self-governance, is key to enable and enhance further the contributions of Indigenous peoples in protecting the planet. It's now there is not a scientific evidence which shows that it is in our territories where the biodiversity is most vibrant. Whether these are ecosystems or plants or animals or what have you. And so I think that the thing that needs to be done is to use these evidences and to tell the governments and even other actors that to tell the governments we are part of nation building. We are not against development. We are not against progress. We just want to ensure that our ways of life and our ways of relating with nature, among others, are respected and not considered subversive or terroristic acts. When we fight against a mining company, you should not look that as an act of terror, because we are fighting against it because this will destroy the territories that the world depends on. It's not just us who are depending on these ecosystem services that are provided by our territories. So I think that what we need to do is to really ensure that many Indigenous peoples have the capacity to govern the way their territories are being managed to their customary laws and practices in terms of biodiversity conservation are also supported and not illegal and not made illegal. Their traditional livelihoods, which are which are sustainable and more friendly in terms of the environment, should not be illegalized. Pastoralism is now showing that they are the ones protecting the grasslands. Our rotating agriculture, which many of us in Asia are practicing, has shown that this is the kind of agriculture that doesn't destroy the lands and that doesn't that allows for diversity of food crops to continue to exist. So for us, we think that these customary practices and laws, whether this is saving the forest, managing a fire, protecting the water aquifers, we have laws that govern us in our communities on how we should do this. And I think that it's the task of the government to respect and recognize these laws and not fight against these customary laws and customary governance systems. We have our elders, our wisdom holders, as well as our spiritual leaders, who are all working together to save our territories. I've seen in several places that even the justice authorities, their own that of Indigenous peoples, are imprisoned because they are charged as not doing justice or as not in conformity with the modern justice system. So I have seen in indigenous guards, in Latin America, who are the ones guarding their territories against drug cartels, against destructive projects, among others. And so these are the governance systems that are in place, and I've seen that in several places. One example I always cite is what I have seen in Mexico. In Michoacan, there are the Puripecha people who have been managing their territories, but unfortunately the drug cartels came and started to deforest their forests, and the people organized themselves and they drove away they barricaded the tracks of these drug cartels getting out the wood from the forest, and then they kicked out the authorities, the officials who are very corrupt and in collusion with the drug cartels, and now they are the ones governing their territory. And I talked to the Mexican government about this. I asked them, I said, I talked to these people. They have their own indigenous uh, government, their municipality, and they told me that this is what they did. And now they can show indicators that will show that they have better health, better well-being, their trees are being protected, and all this, and they have their own indigenous guards. And so I said, do you agree that they are in a much better shape today? Because the government, if in fact, filed a case against them when they declared their self-government, but they won in the Supreme Court. The indigenous peoples won in the Supreme Court. So when I talked to the government said yes. Actually, there are indicators that will indeed show that their resources are better managed and they have better security, and the well-being of the children who used to be recruited by the drug cartels is better now. So that those are just the few examples that I have seen, and of course my own experience in my own community, that will tell me, that has convinced me that indigenous governance is really important if we are to ensure that this biodiversity remains here in our planet, and that we are able to so that we will be able to mitigate the problems of climate change and biodiversity degradation.
As you just heard Victoria Tauli-Corpuz mention, the approval by IUCN members of the motion to protect 80% of the Amazon and to ensure that indigenous peoples are permitted to govern and manage any new protected areas was one of the most important outcomes of the World Conservation Congress. And it's not just big news for indigenous rights activists, of course, it's important for all life on Earth. The Amazon is the largest rainforest in the world, and scientists are telling us that the region has already lost 17% of its forest cover, while an additional 17% has been degraded by logging, wildfires, and climate change-induced drought. That means that the Amazon is rapidly approaching a tipping point beyond which it could shift from rainforest to degraded savanna and shrubland habitats, releasing massive amounts of carbon into the atmosphere along the way. So we wanted to hear more about the 80% protection plan and what comes next. The Amazonian indigenous group COICA helped push the motion to protect the Amazon. So I asked COICA program director Zach Romo about his own experience of the IUCN World Conservation Congress in Marseille, France.
Well, the experience at the Marseille was very revealing. We went there after months of work, which with the help of many allies, we had managed to establish a proposal for a revision of the climatic and environmental goals for the Amazon that was technically viable and based on solid scientific arguments. Our intention was simply to make this work public and start a long-term communication campaign so that our leaders can express their concerns and formulate their proposal to the IUCN community. But in the end, the expectation about the proposal escalated, and we realized that as the days passed, there was a lot of support and people at our side who shared the vision. That was very, very comforting. Our team and our leaders constantly received signs of affection and support, and that was one of the most satisfying things. Knowing that what we were working on in some way brought hope. Also, in practice, uh, our proposal and its implementation would be an immense technical and political challenge. Indigenous peoples being admitted with the right to vote to the first time in this edition of the IUCN Congress means that our governing council formulated a specific mandates for the presentation of our leaders at this event. COICA had to review the relevance of the motions that existed on the table, act jointly and coherently with the aspiration of the rest of indigenous peoples of the world present at the Congress, who were planning and carrying out the World Summit of Indigenous Peoples and Nature and the launch of the Global Indigenous Agenda at the IUCN Congress. So We are very proud and happy of the work we accomplished and all the advances on indigenous peoples that we were able to achieve as a collective at the IUCN Congress. But at the end, the decision of the COICA leaders was not only to vote, it was also to propose a global call to the defense of nature and its rights. And in this way, the motion 129 was born.
Yeah, Motion 129, of course, was the motion to protect 80% of the Amazon by 2025 and to ensure the support of indigenous peoples who live in and have always protected the forest. Can you tell us more of the specifics of what exactly Motion 129 called for?
Well, COICA's mission in attending the IUCN Congress was precisely to generate advocacy with a global campaign to review the global environmental and climate plans and ambitions, seek support among other IUCN members and non-indigenous platforms to demonstrate the need to consider an approach to a different goals for the Amazon based on the available data and the urgency of the territorial and political events that the biome currently suffer. That they would not allow the Amazon to maintain its ecological and cultural functions when entering a process of degradation without return. As the scientists anticipate, this was a very dangerous situation, and how Gregorio said, Gregorio is our leader, our main leader, Gregorio Diaz Mirabal. How he said it will be a apocalyptic scenario. The motion in C is called about the first work of checking or let's say reviewing the global goals 30 by 30 and other proposals that we consider that are not applicable, that are not right for the Amazon context. Amazonia for Life, Let's Protect 80% by 2025 was the focus of the campaign that took us to Marseille. This campaign that had the support of a coalition of allies to facilitate global dissemination in an advocacy space such as this Congress. After having had the collaboration of the RISC scientist institution of the Amazonia, and having made the analysis of several researchers such as Carlos Nobre and Thomas Lovejoy, among others, we realized that if the conditions of the Amazon were not specifically clear, it was more difficult to reach our message. So at that time, our leaders made a decision to raise a new and urgent motion that takes up our initiative and puts it in the language of the IUCN. So our motion basically considers the special adverse conditions that the Amazon has suffered. At a political level, destruction by the extractive sectors, violation of rights, fires, and other damages that have made that the 17% have already disappeared because deforestation, and 7% of the biome is in degradation processes. And that deforestation is too close to the 20% that would mean entering in a tipping point. So that was on a point of alert to our leaders, to our governance steering committees, and that's why this initiative at the motion was born. In the same way, the importance of the Amazon is reiterated as a fundamental part of the hydrological and climatic cycles at a global level. And above all, we are talking about our home, where the lives of millions of indigenous people pass day by day. So this is very sad to think about in the way that something like a disaster in the Amazon may happen in the very near future. We justly propose to respect the international, with this motion, we propose to respect the international agreements that guarantee rights, the moratorium on industrial activities in the Amazon, the activation of quick access, resources of quick access for indigenous peoples that allow them to improve their livelihoods and continue with the great work they are doing that manage their territories. Thus, we also show that indigenous territories in use of and enjoy of the rights constitute an efficient solutions and the same level of national protected areas in indicators like deforestation avoided, as an example. No?
Can you say a bit more about why indigenous rights are so important to this call for Amazon protection?
Both the IPCC and RISC in their latest reports have shown that the indigenous territories that are in use and enjoy of their human and territorial rights demonstrate their own models of more efficient territorial management with good in deforestation indicators, very positive in relative to areas that are outside of indigenous territories of national protected areas. So when you have a healthy governance on indigenous territories with rights and in good standing, you have a very efficient mechanism of conservation. However, this work is not recognized, and generally the costs of management, control, and monitoring are run with resources from the communities themselves, making it even more difficult to have a decent livelihood while taking care of their home. Most of the indigenous peoples that are running effective mechanisms of territorial governance are in the lack of resources to bring development to their communities. So it's very sad. This also, that's why on motion also make a call to prepare more efficient, more equity in the resources distribution. About most of them are climatic. Most of them are resources that are directed to the countries, but these resources don't even reach these communities. But the communities are with with positive results in climatic terms. So the first and the main thing here is that the indigenous rights and territorial rights, when are defended, when are in good standing, assure a good territorial governance and are good tools to avoid deforestation. So the first thing you have to guarantee is the indigenous rights to achieve good results.
So what's next now that the IUCN Congress has approved the motion? What's the next step for you and COICA to push for it to become a reality?
After Marseille, many opportunities have opened up. However, the implementation requires a great deal of work in establishing the first steps that enable an effective implementation. COICA, with its national organization, has begun an analysis work country by country in order to understand the special conditions of each one and aim to generate their own roadmap by country in a logical order. We are focusing as a first effort to be able to start with our proposal is to activate the motion of the IUCN is to generate processes of recognition, demarcation, and titling of indigenous territories. This could be the first enabling factor. The technical and immediate political action to activate projects and campaigns that facilitate the actions Actions like strengthening of the people's own territorial management models, indigenous people with consent, expansion, delimitation, and titling of ancestral territories, restoration of deforested and degraded areas, promotion of livelihoods based on the sustainable management of ecosystems with indigenous economic approaches, actions like agreements and financial architecture adequate to allow direct access of the indigenous peoples and communities to technical and financial resources, as an example. And another thing we are working in is to promote campaigns for moratorium on industrial activities and prevention of fires in the primary forest. We have started with the analysis and also on a financial approach uh, because this was a very common question from the allies that had on a meeting with us. So we are working on in a global financial requirement for the initiative. We hope to have a very first document maybe in this month because we are trying to present it at COP26 in Glasgow.
Okay, so you're hoping to present that at the COP26 climate talks that kick off at the end of the month. There's also the online component of the Convention on Biological Diversity happening next month. Are you planning on attending, and what will you be pushing for there?
Well, we have a work team that is precisely contributing with an advocacy proposal in the post 2020 framework. We are adapting the implications of our proposal in Marseille, but basically we would be addressing the need of the full and effective recognition of the roles and rights of indigenous peoples and local communities. Another thing we are focusing there is that we must conserve at least the 80% of the Amazon by 2025. That is our main proposal. We are trying also to make some approach to end all harmful and perverse incentives by 2025 in the Amazon, and the need of the right funding support in inversions with a biodiversity positive structure and fair transformation of the economic sectors. And we need to get this is very important because we need to get serious about the implementation and compliance of the country. So that will be our main focus in our work group for the CDB COP 15.
I know a lot of countries will be pushing for a global 30 by 30 target at the Convention on Biological Diversity, COP15. What's your take on that?
Well, at the beginning, we were reviewing the global goals in various aspects, and we realized what the world needs is to establish solid goals that reflect a real commitment and an adequate ambition to face the risks that the planet faces today. We feel that 30 by 30 does not comply with the solid scientific technical base, and that in the case of the Amazon is not applicable. If we take into account that indigenous territories are effective conservation mechanisms, according to Rice and other researchers, the 34% of the Amazon would already be protected by them, making it necessary to rethink the 30 by 30 in the case of the Amazon. That is what has moved us to present our 80% by 25 proposal. So we will be making some statements about these facts. We don't identify with the proposal 30 by 30 because we think that is not enough in the Amazon case.
So with the UN climate talks, COP26 in Glasgow, and the UN Biodiversity Conference, COP15 in Kunming, coming over the next year or so, it's a very pivotal time for the future of conservation. What do you hope more broadly to see the world accomplish?
Our hope is effectively make some impact in the global public policies. We hope that the states realize that we are in a point that is very important, the decisions they make. We hope that all the effort that indigenous peoples in the Amazon is recognized and treated with equity and justice. We need to dream on a better future where the governments like Bolsonaro are not allowed to take lead on a country because they make so much damage to the global society, not only for the Amazon biome, just because most of the people that thinks that they are right, devastating and depleting resources of the world are right. So our main hope is that the sites where we are not able to make decisions, governments especially take and realize that most of the solutions are in their hands, and the global community of indigenous peoples and NGOs and activists are making their efforts. But if there is not a real commitment from the countries, if there is not a real actions from the countries, what we are, we will be crying and expecting forever that the things change, but we don't have that time. Maybe for the next year is too late. So our main hope is that most of these countries can hear us, can understand us, and make some commitments, basic commitments to begin to save the Amazonia, in our case, and the world, in the case of the rest of the indigenous peoples of the earth.
If you enjoy the Mongabay Newscast, we ask that you please help spread the word by telling a friend. That is the best way to help expand our reach and keep the show growing. Another way to help is by becoming a monthly sponsor via our Patreon page at patreon.com/Mongabay. We are a nonprofit news outlet, so just $1 or more per month would really help us with offsetting production costs and hosting fees. So if you're a fan of our audio reports from Nature's Frontline, please head to patreon.com/Mongabay to learn more and support the Mongabay Newscast. You and your friend can join the listeners who've downloaded the Mongabay Newscast more than 250,000 times by subscribing to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. Or you can download our app for Apple and Android devices. Just search either app store for the Mongabay Newscast app to gain fingertip access to new shows and all of our previous episodes. And of course, you can read all of our news and inspiration from Nature's Frontline at mongabay.com. Or if you prefer to keep up with us on social media, follow us at facebook.com/Mongabay or on Twitter and Instagram. Our handle is @Mongabay on both those platforms. Thanks as always for listening to the Mongabay Newscast. I'm your host, Mike Gurecki, signing off. Talk to you again in 2 weeks.